I think it's safe to say that a lot of video games that still hold the classic title amongst a majority of people who play video games probably hold that title for very many a good reason. And I think one of the biggest reasons is longevity. I find it incredibly easy to come back to games like Super Metroid, the original Doom, Perfect Dark, Slay the Spire, Dark Souls 2, hell, any of the Dark Souls except, 3. These games are ones that I feel that even though the first time playing through them can be an almost magical experience, such as wandering around the decrepit Zebs or the post-cyberpunk cities in Perfect Dark, but I would argue that these games are all still just as fun the second, third, or even 10th time through. I think I've beaten Super Metroid more times than any other game in my life except for one in particular. The remake of Resident Evil on the GameCube. I think there is something about this game that makes it almost infinitely replayable, and I think that this game is a relic of older game design. In my opinion, it stands in a harsh contrast with its future sister game, Resident Evil 7. And in this video, I'm going to briefly compare these two entries in the franchise. I've seen videos comparing 6 and 7 because of their drastic differences, and even comparing the Resident Evil 2 remake with 7, but not really any videos comparing Remake 1 and 7, which I find strange because in theme, setting, and progression, these entries are very similar, and 7 is always praised for its return to form. But in the end, the point that I want to make is that I don't think Resident Evil 7 has enough longevity to become a classic. The gameplay of Resident Evil 7 is very pure. All of the mechanics are very deliberate, and everything in the game feels like the developers put so much love and care into the game. The mansion feels so much more real than the one in the remake, and the sound design is truly magnificent. The thumping, violent footsteps of Mr. Baker as he trudges around the mansion looking for you, all the way down to the detail of shotgun shells jiggling around in the barrel of the gun as you run around with it. The use of first person is so effective in making the game feel scary, and I think that is what the game does so well. I'll never forget the first playthrough where I anxiously downloaded the game. I got so stoned and immersed myself completely into the world of the game. I bypassed normal and went into the Madhouse difficulty, unaware that the mode was essentially a rearranged mode of the game, and got the absolute shit scared out of me when I managed to turn this corner here and got ambushed by a spider molded. Okay, just turn around this corner. What the fuck is that noise? I quickly realized my error, however, and played the game under the correct circumstances. The game flows so well in the correct story mode that I would be hard-pressed to say that no other game in the series comes even close. The initial few hours of the game where you're discovering the guest house and encountering Mia leading into the cat and mouse play of Jack Baker among the back corner of the house is one of the game's highlights. The staircase near the kitchen being broken is a magnificent little bit of world building and is excellent at making the player curious. In this early area of the game, the only place that you can manage to go through is in the small hallway, the kitchen, and the living room. Leaving this broken staircase is such a smart decision because it leaves an area that you feel like you normally should be able to go to inaccessible, and to me, I distinctly remember being like a little kid again being told that they cannot go somewhere by an older parent. I was left wanting with curiosity and pondering all of the possibilities that could be peeking above my character's head. And I think especially in the early game, that is something that Resident Evil 7 does almost, if not just as well as the remake on GameCube. Both games manage to hold off chunks of the respective mansions at a time. In 7, you start in the small back hallway, which quickly expands into the garage, and then into the mansion proper. The creepy, off-putting, schizophrenic mumblings Marguerite spouts as you find her wandering in the backyard is a foreboding moment as you have yet to step foot outside of the initial mansion. Everything is spoon-fed to the player, which is excellently well done and paced. Your first playthrough is wrought with suspense and constant surprises with blood-boiling set pieces such as the chainsaw fight with Jack at the end of the first act, which also happens to be another unfolding piece of the puzzle box as it opens the backyard. And in true tantalizing fashion, you can see Lucas's section of the house that is gated off and another 2 buildings entirely that are left to explore. When I first wandered outside, I could feel my mind racing with possibilities what lied beyond each of these gated parts of the games, and the backstory of how they came to be this way. The slow pace of the story being dripped like a leaky faucet as the game progresses through in-game dialogue and the phone calls to Zoe Baker, and also through the snippets of conversations you have with the rest of the Baker family, is another highlight that the game does very, very well. It keeps a significant aura of mystery. Who is the grandmother that eerily shows up unannounced through multiple points of the game? What happened to the Bakers? Who is this creepy little girl? And why the fuck do the character models look like trash? And in my opinion, regardless of what you think of the payoff for any of these questions are, I think it's hard to deny that the developers had the ability to keep your attention and engagement of these questions as you progress through the game. In another comparison, I think that the game should be praised about coming back to the roots of the franchise. Gone are the insane balls-to-the-wall action set pieces. Kinda. And a welcome return of the slow, methodical exploration with a world that tells a story without talking. The abandoned marsh house, I think, is the peak of atmosphere and mood in Resident Evil 7. The first person brings a lot to the table when it comes to the immersion of the game. A lot of people will disagree with me on this, but I think that the fixed cameras of the old games are mood setters all on their own. And while I think that the unsettling positions of a lot of the camera placements in the original games are effective and are the number one staple of Resident Evil as a franchise to me, I can't deny the immersion that being in first person brings to the game. You can almost feel the cold, thick, damp air that brushes against Ethan as he wanders around outside in the empty, vacant corridors of the mansion itself, almost acting as a vacuum that you can almost feel suffocating you as you wander around its hallways. Now, looking at the remake on the GameCube, I would find it almost impossible to argue against the fact that it's the most atmospheric game from that entire generation. The static cameras bring a tangible feeling of malevolence watching over you. Each room of the manor feels visually and audibly distinct from each other. Some areas of the mansion that stick out to me are the small upstairs lab room with the haunting melody that feels like spiders crawling up your back, as the soft bubbling of the aquarium makes me think that the bubbling, rumbling, building up over and over and over again is the only thing that your character would be listening to as they read that final letter written by Martin Crackhorn, or the dark, damp, arduous spider-filled hallways that lie just behind the basement kitchen. The tight corridors of the cabin have this eerie feeling even more so than the abandoned manor, because unlike in the mansion where it strangely doesn't have that many bedrooms except for basically the only one on the first floor, and because of this you get this uncomfortable sense of the mansion not really housing people despite all the zombies that wander aimlessly among its corridors, but in the cabin, you were constantly walking in between people's bedrooms, seeing their hominess and messiness, their final letters written to their people that they loved, their bathrooms. You get a real sense of the loss from the experiments from the Umbrella Corporation in the cabin, and it's truly haunting. Another thing that I think really helps add to the atmosphere is the flavor text that both games utilize. In the remake on GameCube, it almost feels like a D&D session with a passionate dungeon master who will answer almost any question that you have about the environment with enough detail that you can really picture exactly what your character is touching, looking at, and thinking about. Even something as mundane as a nearly off-frame painting on the wall can get something as descriptive of the painting itself and down to how it makes your character feel about it. It's one of my favorite things about the older games, not just the remake. These little touches are not necessary, as a lot of the things that you can examine are actually just pointless. A nightstand? A window? A fucking plant? But that's the thing. These small additions help make the world feel more alive and make you feel more involved with it. And I think it helps build the atmosphere. You get to feel the cold chill of a window left open, or see the detail of a discarded cabinet, or imagine alongside your character the chills that they get when they look at an old bloody lab equipment where you realize that the zombies that you've been killing are helpless people who were experimenting with things that they shouldn't have been. And Resident Evil 7 does still use this system. Kinda? It's still there, but its use is drastically diminished. I would say that a majority of it is used near the beginning of the game, and it's most effective when looking at some of the pictures of the Baker family near the beginning of the game, or some of the earliest appliances in the guest house, such as the bird in the microwave, or the disgusting fridge. but as the game progresses, the use of this feature slowly becomes less and less evident, and by the end of the game becomes almost an afterthought. Due to the much more action-oriented focus of the game, while still being subdued by more recent games in the franchise by comparison, please don't misinterpret this. The examine feature is mostly used for important items or puzzles. The game does have some memorable uses beyond the game's intro, however. The most memorable one probably being in the first save room that you find, where you can examine some old disgusting socks and Ethan remarks about how much they really stink! It's a nice little bit of character interjection, and I wish the game used it a bit more than it does. But I think I could sum up a lot of the implementation of this mechanic with this little sequence right here. Right after you gain control of the game after the prologue, odds are the first thing that you will do is open this door right here. It leads to a hallway in which you can see a metallic room with a big sign that says, Garage. If you walk up to the sign, you will notice the RE Engine's notification button will come up, indicating that you can examine it. Oh! I wonder what it will tell me about it. Will it talk about the rust on the sign, indicating that the rust has ruined the sign, telling the player about how long it must have been hanging there unattended? Or maybe it will describe some interesting detail that the player doesn't notice, or even what Ethan thinks about this sign. After all, I'm sure a lot of the player base won't examine this until they have to go through the garage, which happens after the player finds the first save point, meaning that they would have looked at the socks already. Maybe Ethan will say something amusing. Oh, yeah, okay. The gunplay itself is also incredibly satisfying. It's slow, heavy, and deliberate. It feels appropriate for the type of game that it is. Ethan does not have his gun at the ready at all times, just like the classic games, so if you feel like you need to shoot an enemy, you need to steady your weapon, aim, and then fire. The starting pistol near the beginning of the game is honestly more effective than most pistols in the series, and especially the one from the remake. Whereas a pistol would take upwards of 6 to 9 shots in the original game to take down a zombie, mostly due to the restriction of not being able to have full control of where you're aiming, the molded on average take around 5 to 6 shots to kill, and they seem much more susceptible to headshots. The gun mechanics in general in 7 are much more modern and much more reliable. The molded that you encounter in the game are still beefy bullet sponges, but compared to RE2 Make that came out after, it feels like the game is much more forgiving on headshots. I would say that this sorta makes the game easier no matter what difficulty you end up using. Even on the Madhouse difficulty, the molded enemies take around the average amount of bullets that the zombies take in the remake. It just doesn't feel too much harder than the base game, except for the encounters with the family members. The first two, with Jack Baker in particular on the Madhouse difficulty, are especially grueling, as Jack can basically metaphorically run where you can only walk, which makes the first encounter a highlight of difficulty, as you can't fight him back because you have to be sneaky to complete this first section. The variety of enemies has been a point of contention from the fans concerning this game. I often hear the criticism that the molded are too one-note, as the only variety between the 4 types are normal, big fucking arm, spider, and but whenever I hear this criticism, I often don't really see it in tandem with praising the absolute sheer varied nature of the Bakers. Each encounter with them feels like a gauntlet from start to finish, and I think that in contrast with the first game, the Bakers are something new, refreshing, and I think that it's what the franchise needed. With the exception of Resident Evil 2 and 3 with Mr. X and Nemesis respectively, the bosses in the original games never felt like an overlooming threat that you had the chance to run into at any given time. But considering those 2 exceptions, what makes 7 in my opinion stand out from the rest of the pack so well is that 7 is constantly swapping out new threats for you to deal with, but all of them still have this looming dark, overcast sort of dread. Kind of like when you're having a nightmare, and you can't really stop yourself from imagining and manifesting the thing that you fear most over and over again. The downside to this is that I think the game relies on a stealth system far too often, and I really think it hinders the first encounter with Marguerite, despite the action-oriented outcomes that both characters' stories end with. In the encounter with Jack, specifically from the first real encounter with him, it makes sense as you are some random schlub who is completely inept and totally out of his element. But by the time that you're in the swamp house and you're stealthing around Marguerite, it just feels kinda lame that you have to resort back to the stealth hide-and-seek game that you were playing from the beginning. In my opinion, it drags that part of the game down, and I really wish that the game kept opening up its mechanics instead of resorting back and restraining you from them. The enemies in the original few games always felt connected, but with the world separate from your playtime. So I think that in this specific aspect, while yes, a good chunk of your playtime will be dealing with somewhat bland molded enemies, another good chunk of the game is really dealt with the cat and mouse of the Baker family and Evelyn, which, if you ask me, is a nice change of pace, and in this specific instance, it's something I think 7 did better than the remake. But looking back at the original game again, on just the enemy variety alone, the game feels so far ahead of the curve. It has its standard bullet sponge zombies, which is what this franchise is known for, but it also has the classic zombie dogs, the very intense and threatening hunters, the spiders, the disgusting bug creatures, and the impossible to forget Crimson Heads. And that's not even taking into consideration the bosses of the remake. While not, massive in terms of enemy variety, the game never really feels monotonous because while the game is mostly dealt with the zombies, the game feeds the variety of enemies to the player at a consistent pace, even if you are playing through the game for your first time. The game feels much better paced due to the much larger areas of the game as well. The mansion in the remake is fucking gigantic, especially when compared to the mansion in 7. I distinctly remember playing through 7 for the first time and thinking that just by making the initial mansion bigger, I would have had more fun with the game. It felt almost like blue balls when you realize that the entire mansion in 7 is basically as big as the left wing of the remake's initial mansion. And that comes into bigger criticism when you think about the fact that the remake still has the cabin, the underground, the yard, and the lab. Meaning unless you know the order of events that you need to complete to finish the game, you will be left wandering around the halls of the manor examining every item, every piece of scenery, and engrossing yourself in the atmosphere, which in my opinion only helps the game leave an impact on you. And let's not forget that after the confrontation with Lucas, the game takes a pretty sharp nosedive in quality. The cave section near the end of the game, alongside the entire boat section, while not terrible, are definitely not great, relying way too heavily on action and a lot of stupid, story-driven jump scares that on my most recent playthrough left me chuckling rather than anything due to their so obvious, gotta be scary nature. And if I had to rank the things that I think RE7 should be praised for, I think that bringing back puzzles should definitely be near the top of the list, if only just below the concept of bringing horror back to the franchise in general. The puzzles are a mixed bag, but I'm absolutely not the first person to say such things. The range of puzzles range from feeling like an old school classic puzzle to a new fresh take in the franchise. The most impactful ones are the VHS puzzles, which are actual flashes of genius. Seeing a solution in the past and using the knowledge learned through playing through them only make these brief encounters with them all come across as memorable. The most famous one probably being the Happy Birthday puzzle room, which is so noteworthy that it makes me wish there was an entire bonus game built around these kind of rooms. But not all of the puzzles are built equally. While some hold true to the find item, use item sort of puzzles that have always been present for the franchise, I think the game sort of relies a bit too heavily on the lame shadow puzzles that show up around 3 to 4 times throughout the game, which does include the secret backyard shadow puzzle. The remake on GameCube has a rough total of 25 puzzles, but only about 20 to 22 of them are actually necessary for you to get through the game. Something that's interesting, however, is within the 2 campaigns, the number of puzzles that you're even allowed to do varies. For instance, when you go into the cabin residence around the midpoint of the game, you encounter Plant 42, and it's a big, scary, evil plant that has ravaged the entire building and has rooted itself throughout a lot of the rooms in the area. It's a looming threat that you slowly find out about as you explore the rooms in the residence. While doing that, however, you find a room that has these candles that illuminate these special symbols. Soon after, you find a room with a keypad lock that uses these symbols, so you go back and color code them in your brain with corresponding billiard balls, and then you come back and find a scrawled formula that turns out is a poisonous chemical combination that was made as a backup just in case of this exact situation with 42. So you sit down and work out the formula, and boom, wow, you have a chemical that you can use to kill the big scary plant. But here's why this puzzle is so cool. If you're playing as Chris, he just isn't allowed to do this puzzle. The game implies that Chris is sort of a fridge with a shotgun, and he doesn't even bother with solving this, so the only option that you have is to resort to using said shotgun and blasting the thing to oblivion. But if you're Jill, where you're the only character that is allowed to solve this puzzle, you don't have to solve it either. The game gives the player control, especially on a repeat playthrough where you can toy with the story and gameplay loop to make a future playthrough different and a little bit more interesting. You can play Jill the most fluidly and either mildly roleplay her as a brainiac with a gun or a special forces agent who has a mini fridge alongside Chris's beef slabs. Resident Evil 7 has a few too many of the same style of puzzle repeated, like the shadow puzzle that I implied earlier, and rely a bit too heavily on the find item get item for a game that really only has about 10 puzzles, if that through its entire runtime. If you ask me, the most memorable average puzzle is probably the one where you have to open specific doors in a morgue, which gives you an important key to progress through the game. The best that the game has to offer in terms of replayability is just flat out skipping the VHS puzzles. There's no twist or cool gameplay reasoning behind why Ethan suddenly has fourth dimensional mental capabilities where he can suddenly know in advance that the fireplace has a secret compartment or anything like that. It just incentivizes you to skip the best puzzles in the game, which is what Resident Evil is known for. All of that being said, I think what Resident Evil 7 does best is the sense of mystery. It's hard not to feel engaged with Resident Evil 7, especially on that first playthrough. But Resident Evil 7's story is so central to the actual gameplay that I believe that it makes subsequent playthroughs more irritating rather than fun. It has mechanics that are good and scares that are good as well. But whenever I want to start another playthrough of 7, I want to think of some of the high points like the cat and mouse game with Jack, or the old abandoned house that Marguerite resides in. But I only ever think about annoying story points that don't matter to me anymore because I know all of this stuff already. Horror is diminishing returns, and in a game like the original Resident Evil, I would argue that while yes, the horror on the second playthrough is severely diminished, you unlock the ability to know the mansion and its surroundings like the back of your hand and therefore have free reign to abuse the puzzle box design of the mansion and speedrun it. The thing that you unlock by beating the original game of Resident Evil is the fun mode. The game is still fun to play because you aren't being held back by unskippable story beats or horror that is tailor-made and built around the unknown. In Resident Evil 7, there is a section where you are wandering around a decrepit part of the house that you quickly find out is more or less a breeding ground for the mold that has been erupting around the manor. The scene is very, very slow and very scary. I would say that it's inarguably the highlight of the horror of the game. I'll never forget my first playthrough of this section where almost every single solitary sound startled me and my mind raced with what lied beyond in the darkness. It's so heavy you can almost feel it bleeding into your eye sockets from your screen. But you know what happened on my second playthrough of the game? Which, don't forget, was 3 years after the first time I beat it. I remembered the emotions that part of the game gave me and was optimistic of playing through it again, but I knew nothing happened in that section. And in a section of a game that is so slow and so brooding to be designed around the fear of the unknown means that it's not going to hold up well on a second playthrough, which in a horror aspect is not good, but passable, as in my example of the original. But it's also not fun from a gameplay perspective because it's you just wandering around in pitch black series of rooms that just go on and are obviously designed to be more or less a straight line from the start of the sequence to the end of it. An example of where the story interferes with the actual game itself is the intro of the game. From a second playthrough perspective, there are so many points of dull story bits that you cannot skip if you were just trying to play through it again. You have to watch this intro cutscene that sets up a twist, then watch Ethan drive to the Baker house in another cutscene, then wander around the back of the house, go through the entire bottom half of the guest house that you can't skip the dialogue for, deal with this impossible to skip fight that you almost can't lose, go through the whole dramatic situation of killing Mia, and then the phone call with Zoe, and then the surprise of severing your hand, and then the real boss fight with Mia, and then the real game proper starts. But not before another cutscene that is literally just you being talked to by the Baker family. I looked up speedruns of Resident Evil 7, and its prologue is literally an unskippable 17-minute and 30-second preamble of stuff that on your second playthrough is just tedious. It's just fluff to make the first experience of the game tense and interesting, which obviously is what they were going for, but if you ask me, it makes me less likely to play the game again. One of the beautiful things about the older games is that the stories are there and are important, but on repeated playthroughs, if that isn't what you're interested in, you aren't forced to deal with it. It's a video game first and a story third. In the original game, there is a story set up, and obviously I would say that the game does have a preamble, a prologue, an introduction, a setup, a preface, a prologue, a part of the game that is unskippable, important story setup that you have to play through in order to start the game. Just like Resident Evil 7. But you know how long it takes to get to the actual game itself? If you're playing as Chris, then it takes less than 1 minute if you know what you're doing, and on your first playthrough it will take about maybe 3 since you have to get used to the tank controls first. And as Jill, I would say maybe about 3 minutes on your first playthrough, since her campaign is far more story driven and is usually considered by many to be the canon story. And if you're playing the game through a repeated playthrough, then again, just like Chris, it's less than a minute as well, since you can, skip the story beats. And again, I just want to make this very clear that I'm not saying that Resident Evil 7 or any game that is story-driven is inherently bad because of the developer's decision to make it geared towards telling a full narrative that they wanted to tie into the gameplay mechanic elements. And speaking of gameplay elements, there is one more thing I feel like I need to bring up. The Madhouse mode, in a sense, puts to rest a lot of these points that I've brought up in terms of longevity and replayability. And I have to admit that I wondered how I was going to tackle this point in the video. But I think I know how, and here's what I had to say about the Madhouse mode. Madhouse is a rearranged mode of the game, meaning that the game puts some points out of sequence and spices up the flow of the original game. It's also the game's hard mode, meaning that not only will your playthrough be different, it also gives incentive for the hardcore to play the game again, and as such, it's the only mode in which the game's ink ribbon mechanic from the original games returns. But as someone who loves the challenge of the older games, and as someone who also started the Resident Evil 2 remake on hardcore and has not played the game on normal one time, Madhouse is far too difficult for the average person to ever be able to play through the whole game. A majority of the bosses are crapshoots. The boss fight in the garage with Jack Baker is nigh impossible unless you can get him to take control of the car, because only then can you avoid the burnouts that can kill you in about 2 hits with any relative safety. It also just seems like a poor decision when thinking for the longevity of the game itself to make the only way to play the rearranged mode of the game inside of a hard mode. I'm not saying that Madhouse is impossible, but all I'm saying is that it will be far too difficult for the average person, meaning that the said average person will never bother to finish the mode, meaning they will have to go through all of my negative points that I've made throughout this video whenever they want to play the game again. As a closing statement, I again want to reiterate that I don't think Resident Evil 7 is a bad game. I just have a lot of problems with it, and they stand out to me, and I felt the need to address them because I think 7 is a microcosm of a lot of bigger AAA games in the industry that aren't really built for replayability and are more focused on a narrative. How often do you watch your favorite movie? I would say for most of us, not too often, but often enough to remind yourself of the positive or negative experience that you've had with the film. I come back to games like Resident Evil Remake or Silent Hill 2 year after year because I still think about those games over 15 years after my original playthrough. The problem I think most big AAA games is that they all want to give you that perfect cinematic experience and want it to end up being your favorite game. Just like your favorite movie. But that's the thing. Not all of these games can be your favorite game. Just like how out of all the movies that you've ever watched, only a small handful can really be your favorite films. So what you're left with are a bunch of games that you've enjoyed well enough, but ones that you don't feel like coming back to because the game doesn't hold to repeat playthroughs. How often do you watch just any old movie more than once? Probably not often, if at all. It's good to be back. Thanks for sticking around and watching this video. This took me about a month. A lot of re-editing, a lot of fine-tuning on the script. I want to give a big thank you to Survival Horror Network for a lot of the footage. I also want to give a shout out to Cradle to Grave Gaming, the IGN walkthrough, Pyro Puncher, Daunting Darkness, AF Guides HD, Guides Game Pressure, Rob Cram, as well as the Games Entertainer for a lot of the footage I used for this video. I'll try to bring back the original schedule of every other week for a big video, but for the time being, it's going to have to stick to about once a month. I hope that you understand and stick around because I do have some ideas for some other videos in the future. But again, I just want to say thank you for sticking around and watching this till the end. Leave a like, leave a comment, leave a subscription. I would really appreciate it. I normally don't want to be that guy and ask, but I'm gonna do it this time. This video was a lot. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.
Tomato is a fruit, but it also a vegetable.